Welcome to Session 6, the last session in our study of Revelation. This session is entitled Preparing for Eternity. So please turn to chapter 17, verse 1, and page 38 in your workbooks. The last time we met, we talked about chapter 16, the bowls of wrath being poured out and described from the church's perspective. We'll start this session talking about chapters 17 and 18. The bowls of wrath from an earthly perspective, and then after that, chapter 19, the bowls of wrath from a heavenly perspective. And again, you can see the repetition that is on John's mind as he writes this book. So going to chapter 17, verse 1. Here we see the notorious prostitute who sits on many waters. She could be an evil religious system or a humanistic culture where either represents a worldly system of seduction opposed to God. It says she's sitting on many waters, and in verse 15 we read that the many waters that she sits on are people of all cultures. Our culture is used by the beast to control us, to draw us away from God. How can we describe a culture? It would be like asking a fish to describe water. It knows nothing else. Our culture controls and influences us through the news media, internet, TV, sports, movies, advertising, and the people we associate with. John contrasts the harlot, representing pure evil, with the church, which is holy and spotless. And you can see this comparison in the workbook on page 38. Going on to verse 2, we read of the kings of the earth. This does not refer to the 10 kings that are mentioned in verse 12. Those 10 kings or kingdoms that will rule in the end times. These kings are the leaders within our culture, the rich and famous, the top 1%, politicians, leaders in the media and business, sports, Hollywood stars, authors, all who are corrupted by the culture, always wanting more. In chapter 18, verse 3, it reads, "The kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality with her," with the notorious prostitute. And these are the kings that this is talking about in chapter 17, verse 2. The prostitute is also sitting, in addition to sitting on the kings of the earth, she is also sitting on the scarlet beast with 7 heads and 10 horns that you can see here. Note, however, in this verse that no crowns are mentioned. Neither the dragon nor the beast are emphasized one over the other here. Remember that in chapter 13, this beast is the Antichrist, Satan's earthly representative, empowered by Satan. There it has 10 crowns and 10 horns. In chapter 12, the dragon has 7 crowns and 7 heads. But here, there are no crowns mentioned. Both of these beasts, the dragon and the Antichrist, are wrapped into one. It is Satan's last and best shot at us. So, what can we learn from this woman who is sitting on the beast? Prostitutes not only use others, but they are used by others. Just as she sits on or controls people, so our culture controls or influences us. It uses us. But while this evil culture and the kings of the earth that are influenced by her think they're in control, they're actually just along for the ride. These kings are being used by the beast for his own purposes. The beast will hate the prostitute, we're told in verse 16. They will devour her, burn her up with fire. We're going on to verse 4, chapter 17, verse 4. This woman, our culture, is appealing, but realize she is the source of all that is evil. She is the mother of abominations, going back to Genesis chapter 11 and the Tower of Babel, where the people of Babylon wanted to build a city and make a name for themselves. I covered that in the homework on page 31. Most people wouldn't follow Satan, but they would follow a culture of me, me, me. She's attractive. We enjoy her worldly charms. Our culture offers us money, sex, power, influence, fame. In verse 6, we read that this woman was drunk on the blood of the saints. And remember that over 45 million Christians were martyred in the 20th century. Reading in chapter 17, verse 7, I will tell you the secret meaning of the woman and of the beast with the 7 heads and the 10 horns that carries her. The secret meaning that follows in verse 8 has many interpretations by many different Bible scholars, but here's the one that makes the most sense to me. We're told in verse 8 that the beast was and is not and is about to come. And this is repeated at the end of this long verse. The beast once was. This beast, Satan, the power of evil and death, has been around since the fall in the Garden of Eden, until Jesus came. But this beast now is not. Now, this couldn't be a reference to Rome, because Rome was still in power at the time John was writing Revelation. But what no longer was around, what no longer existed? The power of death. It has been defeated. Death has been swallowed up in victory. We read in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 54. The church is growing beyond the Roman Empire's borders. Now, Satan still does evil things. Jesus bound Satan in Matthew 12, verse 29. And so he is bound from dominating God's people as he had previously with the kingdoms of Babylon and Persia, for example. And so he is bound from stopping the church's growth at this point. But we are told that it will come. It will be present again. The truth of God's word defeats death. But if this truth is rejected by our culture, death is a result, which will bring on the beast's return. I'll digress now from Revelation for just a few minutes to explain our culture's departure from the truth with a short history lesson. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 3, we are told that the day of the Lord, the 7th trumpet, won't come unless the apostasy comes first. And apostasy is defined as a departure from the truth that God has revealed in his word. After the departure from the truth, the day of the Lord will come. And so truth is important. In fact, when Jesus is before Pilate, he tells us why he came into the world. In John 18, verse 37, I have come into the world for this, to testify to the truth. And what does Pilate say in return? He asked the question, what is truth? Well, here are 5 things that can define truth for us. First of all, truth is real. It is a picture of what really exists or what really happened. If we are a witness in a trial, we have to raise our hands and swear to tell the truth. The truth is also objective. It's a fact. It's not just a preference or a personal opinion. Next, we see that truth is narrow. It's narrow in the natural world. 2 plus 2 is always 4. It's not 5 or 3.999. And in the same way, truth is narrow in the spiritual world. In Matthew 7, verse 13 and 14, Jesus tells us in the Sermon on the Mount that the path is narrow. The gate is narrow that leads to life. Also, truth is revealed. It's revealed to us from God. In John 8, 31 and 32, we read that if you abide in my word, you'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free. I think of truth as a bubble, where if you abide within this bubble, if you abide within God's word, you will be set free. But we need to remain within that bubble. More about that later. And last, truth is absolute. It's unchanging. But our culture has fallen from the truth. So I believe we're now in the time of this apostasy that precedes the Lord's return. And let me explain why. After the fall of the Roman Empire, about 450 years after the beginning of the church, the Western Europe and that part of the world centered into the so-called Dark Ages. The only Bibles were hand-copied, and there were not many of them. The printing press, however, was developed by Johann Gutenberg in 1452. And why did he develop it? He's quoted as saying, "Religious truth is imprisoned in a small number of books. Let us give wings to truth in order that she may go and win every soul that comes into this world." And so God's truth was revealed to the common man. People started obtaining copies of the Bible and started reading it. And this was followed by the Renaissance and the explosion of modern science. The revelation of a God who created and ordered a universe led to the discovery of natural laws through observation, and that led to reason. Reason is good. In Isaiah 1:18, God tells us, "Come, let us reason together." Mankind still believed in absolute truth. Again, even in this age of reason, they believed in this bubble of absolute truth, that if they lived within it, that would lead to a peaceful world, to a good life for them, that they could live peaceably with one another. But a very gradual shift started occurring over the next 300 years. And we entered into the age of reason, sometimes referred to as the age of modern man, or the age of the Enlightenment. And what they came to believe was that we can only trust what we observe with our natural senses, what is reasonable. In other words, they started to not believe anymore in miracles, not believing that Jesus walked on the water or changed that water to wine. And so revelation was rejected. But what did reason eventually lead to? It led to turmoil. The 20th century was the bloodiest on record. There were many totalitarian regimes, that of Hitler, Stalin, Mao in China, Pol Pot in Cambodia. There was the Industrial Revolution. And even though that had a lot of good that came from it, cities and urban centers started to grow due to this Industrial Revolution, leading to congestion and tension. And small towns in rural America began to lose their appeal. Technology gave us more tools with which to destroy ourselves. Even though we gained a lot from technology, there was also the bad side to that. And so, after World War II, people lost hope in reason. It didn't lead to the perfect world in which we could be set free. Instead, they concluded there is no absolute truth. Now we can choose to live as we want, with no rules, living in our own little truth bubbles, finding our own truth, doing whatever we want. This led to abortion, drugs, and all sorts of non-biblical sexual practices. Here's a picture of the Parade magazine that is in the Sunday newspapers. And this particular issue talked about Tobey Maguire, the actor. And he was quoted as saying in this article, "I had to find my own truth." And as we go about finding our own truth, the only requirement is that we be tolerant of others. But Christians pop the truth bubbles of others when we say that Jesus is the only way. We are the intolerant ones, the narrow-minded ones. But remember, truth is narrow. And so it seems we're now living in this age of apostasy, this age of rebellion that Paul tells us about in 2 Thessalonians, which will be followed by the day of the Lord. The beast is about to come. Well, that takes us on to, again, chapter 17, verses 9 and 10. We read there that the 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated, and they are also 7 kings. Some believe this to refer to the Catholic Church, ruling in Rome. And of course, Rome is known as the city on seven hills. And here you can see a picture of Rome. Here's the Tiber River and the Vatican. And then here are the seven hills which Rome was built on. But the word that is used here doesn't refer to hills. The word is a reference to mountains, something that is prominent. And so I agree with those Bible scholars who say that these seven heads are seven prominent kings or kingdoms that have ruled or will rule over God's people. Remember from Revelation chapter 12, that chapter emphasized the dragon with seven heads and seven crowns. And this was a picture of Satan that had ruled over God's people from the very beginning. In Revelation 13, this emphasizes a future beast with 10 horns and 10 crowns, and it's a picture of the Antichrist. And when we get to Revelation 17, here we see a combination of both of these. There are no crowns mentioned. These two beasts are now one. All Satan's power and authority will operate through the Antichrist. Going on to the last part of verse 10, we're told that at John's time, 5 of these 7 had fallen. One is. While John was writing this, Rome was still in power. But since that time, it too has fallen. And that's where we are right now. One is yet to come, the 7th head, or the 7th kingdom. So we're now in between the Roman Empire and the revived Roman Empire. Remember back in verse 8, we read that the beast that was and is not is about to come, Satan and the power of death. It was, but is not. He is currently bound from forming a world power that rules over all of God's people like previously during the kingdoms of Babylon or Persia, for example. The gospel is being spread around the world. But now when we get to verse 11, we are told, but here the beast that was and is not is. He has come again. In other words, the revived Roman Empire and the head of it, Antichrist. He is the 8th head, the 8th king or kingdom that will come to power. Note in the last part of verse 11 that it says he is not one of the 7 heads, but he is of or belongs to the 7. He's part of this organization within one of the 10 regions or horns of this 7th head, the revived Roman Empire, but not one of the 7 heads. He then works himself up into power. This gets a little complicated, but I'd like to take just a couple of minutes to explain this in more detail. First of all, we'll look at this from Daniel's point of view, the point of view of the revived Roman Empire, or Antichrist's point of view. In Daniel chapter 7, verse 23, it talks about Daniel's 4th kingdom, which is a reference to Rome. Remember that Daniel prophesied after Egypt and Assyria, and so Babylon is the 1st kingdom that he wrote about, Persia was 2nd, Greece was 3rd, and Rome was Daniel's 4th kingdom. And he says that this 4th kingdom will be different. Continuing in Daniel 7, verse 24, he said that 10 kings or kingdoms will arise from Rome. And this is referred to commonly as the revived Roman Empire. Going on to the last part of verse 24, we read about another, different from the previous ones, one who is not one of the 7 kings. Now remember, this is worded just like it is in Revelation 17, verse 11, where we are told that he is not one of the 7 heads. And so, the Antichrist is not one of the 10 kings. He is somewhere within that organization, but he eventually takes over one of those horns, and he's starting to build up power. He takes over a 2nd, and he takes over a 3rd. It says here in Daniel that he subdues 3 kings. And in so doing, he becomes the major force of this kingdom, of this revived Roman Empire. And so now he is the 8th horn. There were 10 previously. He subdued 3, leaving 7, and now he is the 8th horn. Now let's look at this from John's point of view in Revelation. And this point of view is from Satan's point of view, or the 7-headed dragon. Satan's hand-picked human representative is the Antichrist, and he is of, but not one of, these 7 heads that we read about in verse 11. And just as these previous powers have fallen, he will rise to power within the revived Roman Empire, as we saw in Daniel. And he will rule over everyone else as an 8th head. With the 7 previous gone, he is now that 8th head. But how does this end? We'll realize that in either view, in Daniel 7, verse 26, we are told that he has dominion, but it will be taken away, and he will be completely destroyed forever. Or in John's version, in Revelation 17, verse 11, we are told that he goes to destruction. Now let's look at this in a different point of view, the flow of power. First of all, we see that we as people have power, the masses, those that are referred to in Revelation 17, verse 15. Remember that we were told in Genesis 1:28 to be fruitful, to multiply, to fill the earth and subdue it. But as time went on and sin entered into the picture and greed, we came to be a people of haves and have-nots. And thus we have what is referred to as the kings of the earth, those that are rich and famous and powerful, that have influence and control us. This led to the prostitute and a culture of greed and corruption, but a culture that's appealing and it's alluring to us. We are told in verse 2 that these kings commit sexual immorality with her. And this woman in verse 18 is the great city, and she has an empire, a culture that rules over them. And how does she accomplish this? Well, in Genesis chapter 1, verse 28, we were commanded to spread out, to fill the earth. But what does she do? She gathers us together into cities. In Genesis chapter 11, verse 4, let's make a name for ourselves. There is no God. It's all about us. People are easier to control when grouped together, moving from rural areas to cities. In 1900, in the United States, 13% of the people lived in cities. In the year 2000, it was 50%. This is where businesses and jobs are located. Entertainment, sports, and politics are located in the big cities. In verse 16, we read that these 10 kings or 10 horns will have complete control. They will be the one world government. Verse 16, the 10 horns you saw and the beast will hate the prostitute. They will make her desolate and naked, devour her flesh, and burn her up with fire. So they will now be in control. Remember that earlier I mentioned about numbers being symbolic. And so the number 10 is symbolic of complete control. And I only mention this because it could be that these 10 kings or kingdoms might not be exactly like we imagine them as 10 specific regions or kingdoms of power. Maybe it will be something that is more symbolic in nature. I only say that so that we won't be deceived if it looks a little different than maybe we imagine it right now. Well, from this point, going on to verse 13, we see that Antichrist, the beast, becomes this 8th head. Verse 13, these 10 kings have one purpose, and they give their power and authority to the beast. Remember that in chapter 12, verse 18, the beast came from Satan. it is ultimately Satan who will be in power. Satan gave the Antichrist authority, and he doesn't want to have this person on the earth, the Antichrist, be in charge. It's Satan who wants to ultimately be in charge. But Satan will be defeated. We read in chapter 17, verse 14, "These will make war against the Lamb, but the Lamb will conquer them, because he is Lord of lords and King of kings. Those with him are called and elect and faithful." Going on to chapter 18, this chronicles the fall of the world's economic, political, military, and religious systems. First of all, it speaks of judgment in verses 1 through 3. The prostitute has fallen in verse 2. A culture of sensuality, idolatry, violence, deception, injustice has been discarded. Next, it speaks of separation. We are told to come out of her in verse 4. God's people are called to separate themselves from this evil system so as to avoid their sins and judgments. Starting in verse 9, we read of mourning over Babylon's fall. The leaders of our culture mourn, woe, woe. And in verses 11 through 17, we see businessmen mourning. Notice the list there, starting in verse 11 through 13. It lists different types of merchandise: gold, silver, precious stones. And as you read through the list, you see that the last things that are mentioned are human bodies and souls. It seems that we, as humans, are the least important to those who are greedy and looking to make a profit. Going on to verse 17, we see that even ordinary workers also mourn. And then, in verse 20 through 24, it speaks of rejoicing over the demise of this system. We've covered God's wrath from the perspective of the church and the world. Next, we'll see it from heaven's perspective.